because central bank is thinking this project is not very good. He don't allow you capital outflow. So you understand me? Maybe I can translate maybe you say a little difficulty. 就是说外管局实际上已经把了一道关，他认为这个项目不好的，他就不让你去投。
对，他是就是说问怎么样的一个改变这个
中国形象，我知道。
对，
所以说现在我们是认为要加强这个外管局的审批。
明白。
Let me translate for that. I think actually said, so this is China government authority to approve the overseas investment for foreign currency. So they already take a much more strict measure to make sure the investment are proper. So this is the first step.
Secondly, some Chinese partner, and you cannot thinking to how to speak English speculation of the foreign valuation and the domestic valuation, because so far a lot of the Chinese company he only for arbitrage, but the China SEC said no, not any case for arbitrage between the foreign market and the China market. So this almost stop Chinese partner unreasonable, very high price to acquisition, to merging foreign company. This is a very bad image for Chinese partner, because especially a lot of the European countries, he not like a Chinese partner to merging and pay very high price to merging the European small companies. So European government don't like some Chinese this model, this business model. Also, Chinese SEC so far also very stop some model like this. This is the Chinese partner so far. We don't do something like this. Cannot offer very high price to merging foreign company, then to change everything, this company, to put this company in the China, some listing company, cannot do something like this. This, I think, this is a very big development for the Chinese investment partner.
And maybe we should finish up. And Jenny, what would you say? What would you advise big Chinese investments in perhaps critical infrastructure assets in Australia, how they go about it?
For the critical infrastructure, I think it becomes difficult because it's part of the much broader picture that is determined by governments and by the critical infrastructure centre and all of these issues, as I said before, are kind of more sensitive than they were. But in terms of how China tries to, I suppose, improve, because this is not just happening in Australia, as has been mentioned. There's a kind of pushback in all sorts of countries, both in Southeast Asia, in the US, and Europe, as well as Australia. And I think being incredibly sensitive to the local kind of community concerns must help, and certainly not trying to take majority stakes always raises all sorts of red flags, and it's going to do so more and more in future, I think.
Okay, with that, everyone, can you please put your hands together to thank our panel?
Oh, thank you. Michael.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Michael, and thanks to the panel on Chinese investment more broadly. That panel incurred significantly on the territory that we now want to focus on, and the context in which this work on Chinese investment more broadly in Chinese investment in Australia has been taking place. and that's on the Australia-China economic relationship, in which context this analysis has been undertaken. And to join me in this panel, I welcome Hu Shu Li again, Heather Ridout, who's Chair of Australian Super, formerly CEO of Australian Industry Group, and also formerly a member of the Reserve Bank Board of Australia. Andrew Parker from PwC, whom you've already met, and Malcolm Broomhead, who's on the board of BHP, and of course Chair of Orica. So thanks very much for joining us. As people have said already, the Australia-China relationship, economic relationship, is big. And Andrew and Phil and others have laid out the dimensions of that, both in trade terms, in terms of the movement of people between the two countries, students, tourists, and very frequently China's also our biggest source of migration these days. So this is a big relationship. And yet, in the last couple of years, there's no question that the Australia-China economic relationship and relationship more broadly has hit a rough patch. We've been talking around that a bit during the course of the conversation thus far. And when you talk to people in China in particular, this seems a bit strange. People are a bit confused about why this is so. Maybe they shouldn't be confused, but they genuinely are confused by why this is so. And they're confused, essentially, they say, because, they thought the Australia-China relationship was in good shape, especially the economic relationship was in good shape. It's gone through some big changes, especially since the commodity boom peaked and we came back. But the adjustments through those changes have been remarkably effective and efficient, reflecting, the workings and deep integration of the two economies, of the market, full bore. If you take the commodities boom, take iron ore, Malcolm, in China, we've seen in the last, since the boom peaked in the last 5 years or so, China rapidly increased import dependence on iron ore, from 61% of total supplies procured by the iron and steel industry to 80%, 81% of total supply. So this is a huge increase in international market penetration of the Chinese economy. And contrary to the Jeremiahs, we've seen in the same period the Australian suppliers increase their market share in those import procurements into the iron ore trade in China, from about 40%, 43% to over 61%. So this is a pretty remarkable, relationship that symbolises a market working well in full blossom around the shifts in relative prices and demand structures and supply, competitive supply out of Australia taking place before our eyes, and yet, there's something wrong with the relationship. So that's a bit of a puzzle, and people are confused about that. And then there are all the other dimensions of the relationship that people have talked about. And on the Chinese side, Australia, though it's a small, middle-sized economy in the global economy, ranks pretty high as a significant supplier of these raw materials into China. About a quarter of these raw materials come out of Australia, so we're not insignificant in the Chinese market. So we've got a big partnership. It's a deep partnership. It's our biggest, and it's important in strategic areas to China. So what's wrong with it? And clearly there are a few things wrong with it. Foreign direct investment has been a big growth area, and it's hit troubles around what's going on in China, but also the policy response and to some extent the community response here. And all these things have happened despite the fact that just a couple of years ago, the two governments formed a comprehensive strategic partnership to guide the longer-term direction of the relationship and focused on the opportunities in the partnership long-term through that and the initiative of CHAFTA, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which has again delivered remarkable changes in the structure and growth of trade in new areas that the Australian economy and the Chinese economy wanted. And this was a pretty big signature agreement, not only for Australia but also for China, because, you know, we've got in key commodity areas here tariffs reducing to zero in a few years' time, much lower barriers to entry in the Chinese market across a range of commodities than there are, for example, in Japan or Korea or some of our other important markets in Northeast Asia. So it's a pretty big deal. So what has actually gone wrong with the relationship? I'll make a few suggestions, but I want to talk to the panel about what's gone wrong and what to do about it. You know, first of all, as people have hinted, you know, the Australia-China relationship has been caught in the backwash of geopolitical developments, especially focused on the China-US relationship, that have knocked it off course a bit. And we've been caught in the undertow of that. And sort of coming to terms with managing that is a big challenge in any circumstance, perhaps a particularly big challenge in the circumstance when we've had fairly finely edged governments, let's put it that way, in Australia, where the political leadership has had lots to concentrate on home politics, lots of focus in concentrating on home politics and less on strategic management of big shifts in international interests and issues like this. The change in Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea is part of the story, and the response to the US to that in terms of ambivalence about the rise of Chinese power, and that geopolitical context that's becoming more and more sharply defined. That's all part of the story. It's also been knocked off balance by what's going on in China since the elevation of Xi Jinping to the chairmanship of the party in China, and trying to interpret political developments there, how the differences in system seem to be accentuated more by these political developments, and worries and anxieties about that and how it affects the relationship politically as well as economically. And that, of course, has been drawn into domestic discussion in Australia in terms of the so-called political interference debate. You know, what this might mean for China's assertiveness in Australian political space. However modest many of the stories were, they certainly captured the imagination of the community, particularly the political security community that has been tied closely to these discussions. And now, of course, there's the war we should not mention, who should lead Trump's trade war, and you know the response to that, and what to do about that. And it's been a clear element in the conversation so far, the tension there, and you know how or whether Australia, given its close alliance relationship and fundamental alliance relationship with the United States, should modify its position around its core interests in the multilateral trading system to accommodate the way in which the trade war out of Washington is being conducted by the Trump administration. So these things have knocked it all a bit off balance. But you know, turning to you, Shuli, first, you know,
okay.
What do you think about the Australia-China relationship? Is it still important to Beijing,
yeah.
and how does it look like from Beijing?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm not the representative of the policymakers, or I'm not a diplomat. Just offer my observations through the business community and the ordinary Chinese people. We have experienced, I have to say, we used to experience a very intensive relationship even among the ordinary people. That was about China and Japan relationship. It was very intensive for a while. I think several years ago. I don't feel the relationship between China and Australia have reached such kind of intensive way. I think it's very normal and very warm, very good, I have to say, among the community, among the Chinese business people. I just spent a 7 days holiday because it was our national day. In Western Australia, Western Australia. And I drove a car driving from Perth north to the Calgary, Shark Bay, and the Calgary. And the more northern I drove, the more I feel like really that Australia was part of Asia. You saw so many Asian factors and everything. There was no Chinese, didn't see Chinese restaurant, didn't see Chinese, but some lot of factors. And I have to say, and I heard on the way back, this year, National Day, the Chinese tourists who traveled in Perth has reached its peak, historical peak. I just want to say that actually I'm very confident, very sure that the relationship with Australia is definitely important to China, and Australia is among the key trading partners of China. And we need to put it into a bigger framework, which is how China plans to continue opening up to the rest of the world in terms of trade, investment, and people-to-people exchange. I'm very confident. And the current situation obviously has lots of challenges, but it also opens up more opportunities for China to collaborate with economies other than U.S., Australia included. Yes, very confident. That's why we are here. And one of our works here was separated the collaboration with financial review. That is why we are very confident for the relationship, part of that.
You're full of optimism. But the reality is that there have been no high-level exchanges between Australian and Chinese political leaders for a couple of years now. No effective. And so there's a problem. So we're getting into Japanese territory here. I mean,
but Chinese in China, the business community didn't feel that way. That is what I said. We used to have very intensive relationship with Japan. That was not only about the political level exchange, such like that. Just people there, all the people felt very intensive, very hesitant, and very confused about what it was going to happen. But not such a situation in China, about China and Australia. Honestly, the people are very normal, very warmly, very friendly toward Australian issues, everything. Yeah,
That's
I
good
see,
news.
especially in the business sector. Yeah.
Malcolm, from an Australian business person's perspective, looking at the relationship now, what are the areas do you think we need to do more work on?
I think the relationship in the last 18 months has been terrible. It's been perplexing and it has been deliberate on our part. And look, there's always going to be differences. There'll always be differences between countries. We have our major security relationship with the United States, our major trading relationship with China, and there's inherent conflicts and that different sort of forms of government and so on. But historically, we've been able to handle that right up through the end of the Abbott government, bipartisan support for the relationship on the Australian side. And for some reason, the recent government chose to go out of its way in the rhetoric to almost insult the Chinese. And that's had, you think about it, the Bow Forum, ministers going to Beijing, you can't get appointments, people couldn't get visas to go to the Bow Forum. That's pretty serious stuff. And it has to affect our ability to invest. I think the change in leadership in Canberra has been a very good thing. I think the recent meeting between the two foreign ministers in New York was positive, and both talked about the common interests and the ability to manage those differences, be they in the South Pacific or elsewhere. And I think that's the key going forward, to get it back to the level it was when Xi Jinping came here, for example, even when Premier Lee came here. It was very good and warm and mutually beneficial. There's huge opportunity for Australia to invest. Sure, it's great to sell iron ore to, as you said, Peter, it's great to sell iron ore to China, and that's something we always do well. It's our competitive advantage. But if we want our economy to go beyond just resources, or beyond resources, to high tech and so on, we have to engage with what will probably be the biggest economy in the world for 100 years. And it's on our back doorstep. So it's very important that we get this relationship right, and it's a relationship to do with the tenor in which we engage. The realities, I think everyone can deal with. So I think there's a lot of beneficial interest and mutual benefit, Golden Road and so on, for us to get involved in, and we should.
Well, we'll come back to the problems in the relationship and how we should deal with them in a moment. But Andrew, do you share Malcolm's view? Is this a short-term problem we've got in the relationship between the two governments and the management of the relationship, or is it a deeper structural problem we've got?
I think we're going to be challenged by China for many years to come. I think we're going to be challenged by China for many years to come. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's a confluence of issues here and things which have changed. And one is most certainly that China itself has changed. And China has become, as many big powers do, when they become bigger, is much more confident and much more assertive, as I said in my introductory remarks, and much more able to already and willing to articulate its national interests on the global stage. And that has caused some areas of friction. I mean, we as a country have struggled to reconcile ourselves to the point that Malcolm has just made, that at some point in the future, whether it's in a decade or 2 decades' time, China will become the largest economy in the world. It may not be the richest if you measure that in GDP per capita terms, but it's certainly going to be the largest. And that brings with it some really confronting challenges for Australia. As I said again in my introductory remarks, that we have historically had very rich and powerful friends. The UK in the first instance, then the US were both our major economic partner and our security guarantor. That is no longer going to be the case going forward. And so we hear successive prime ministers like to say to Australians that we don't have to make choices. That makes everybody feel warm and fuzzy and comfortable. And the reality is that we are going to have to make choices. And we make choices already. Every single day we make choices. Some of them big, some of them small. But those choices are going to get harder and they're getting more complex. And I think as a nation we have to think very carefully about how well we actually know China. I'm sort of reminded of Stephen Fitzgerald, who was Australia's first ambassador to China, was handed a letter by Gough Whitlam when he went on for his first engagement. And I'll just read you a paragraph from that letter. It said, "We seek a relationship with China based on friendship, cooperation, and mutual trust, comparable with that with which we have or seek with other major powers." That seems to me to be a pretty good place to start in thinking about our relationship. But I think if you made an honest assessment of that at every level, in business sense, our politicians, our public servants, I don't think anybody can put their hand up and say that we know our Chinese counterparts anywhere near as well as we know our UK or US counterparts. I think, Peter, therein lies the problem.
What about you, Heather? Andrew's touched upon what the core structural problems are in the relationship. How do you think we should be trying to manage them more effectively?
To me, I think Australia's had since 1972 very constructive, open engagement with Australia. it's getting readjusted. Are you done? Can you all hear me now? Yeah, look, we have a terrific relationship with China, and I agree with Malcolm, it has gone up for us in the last couple of years, it's clear. And it happened very quietly, right? It just kind of was happening, we were getting reports from companies who were having problems, and then it bubbled up when we had a speech by the Foreign Minister in Singapore, and I think that kind of brought it all together. And I think, in a sense, we were able to keep the economic relationship as an economic relationship. We were building cultural ties, that was going very well. We broadened the relationship to include tourism and education, and that was going really well. And the services side was good. The free trade agreement, I remember saying to Rick Wells when he was our first negotiator on the free trade agreement, that's how far I go back in this. I hope you're a young man, you're going to be a very old man when it's done. And we got there in the end, and the strategic partnership was a very big breakthrough in 2014. But I think what's happened, if you look at the things on the foreign investment side, the privatisations, they were critical assets, like electricity grids, and I speak from a position of benefit, because Australian Super ended up buying part of that asset. But I think they were very awkward things for us. And what we've had coincidental with that has been some megaphone politics, not only here but in the US. And the chat has been within Australia, to Australians, rather than about the relationship and trying to keep that alive and vibrant. And I think this populist agenda has been very damaging both here as in the US, and it's been driving this tariff debate. I don't believe much that the tariff debate's about broad US interests. I think it's about Donald Trump getting re-elected, getting his numbers up in the midterms and beyond. Because, I think facts don't really indicate that. So I think really, Australia, all three boards that I serve on, Australian Super, Sims Metal Management, biggest publicly listed recycler in the world, and the ASX. Australian Super, China is a growth, has been identified as a key growth area for us in 2019. Currently have $2 billion, about $140 billion there, mainly in equities, but we're really keen, and we've had an office in Beijing for many years about research and relationship building. The only overseas office that fund has had until recent times when we opened in the UK. So very, very important area for the fund. The ASX, we've been listing Chinese companies quite a few of them. Now they need polishing, quite a few of them as well, to use an expression that our colleague mentioned before. But that's happening, and we have an office in Hong Kong that's doing that. Sims, we export scrap metal to China. We've been doing it for a long, long time. We got ahead of the green sword movement, and we refined the quality of our scrap to make sure we could still export scrap to China. So there's a lot of stuff that's been happening. But we hear in wine, in abalone, in health, there's a range of industries that are being held up because of the change in the relationship. Government is called to this, our relationship with China is not by luck, it's by good management over a long, long period of time. And I really feel we're starting to get some more positive messages. I think Malcolm mentioned the meeting between Maurice Payne and the counterpart recently. And that's a really good thing. We need more of that. We also need business to do more, and other interests to do more of this sort of thing. Keep the relationships and connections vibrant. And I think that'll stand us in good stead when we go through rocky patches. It's in a rocky place.
Yeah, I want to come back, Kahusha, to your faith in the relationship going forward, which at the bottom, I think, as you said it, is connected in your faith in the continuing opening up and liberalisation of the Chinese economy. And all the comments from the Australian side here are premised, whatever the short-term difficulties, in a continuation of that process in China. And I guess the questions that have been raised in Australia and outside China at the moment, to some extent, are questioning your faith to some extent. So I wonder if you could provide us with a bit more evidence that would support your faith in the confidence that China will continue its liberalisation and opening up process, apart from the rhetoric of policy.
Actually, I think I understand all the. I can understand there are a lot of concerns worries or suspects or even hostiles toward toward what has happened in China in different way. But I cannot answer all the concerns very specifically because but generally I have to say that reform is never easy in China actually. There are many key obstacles. Vested interest, the